Marina. Thank you so much for having me here today. And welcome to everyone who's on the line. I see we have well over 300 people from all around Canada and a few from the US as well, which is great. So welcome to you all and thank you for joining us for our webinar. So we're going to be talking about budget-friendly ideas for donor stewardship today, which I think is a really fabulous topic for a number of reasons. Stewardship is really important, as you'll learn during this webinar, not only to increase fundraising revenue, but also to improve donor retention rates. And one of the great things about stewardship is that there's so many ways in which we can steward our donors that are pretty cost effective for us and also allow us to not only utilize the resources we already have, such as staff and board members, to reach those donors and to make sure that they feel really appreciated and also valued as a donor to your organization. So I want to start us out with a question for you all, which will show up as a poll on your screen. And the question is, does your organization do a good job stewarding your donors? So I'll give everyone a minute or so here to respond. So see lots of you answering so far, which is great. A lot of you said so far that you could do a better job at it. Probably about 30% or so have said it's not necessarily your strength. 5% said that you're awesome at it, which is great, and about 8% said you're not sure, which is totally great. So thank you everyone so much for participating in that poll. I think one of the interesting things about asking this question, I find, is just it's a good opportunity for all of us to kind of reflect on the type of stewardship we're offering to our donors and if we're actually doing a good job for that, and where are those areas for improvement. And I'm guessing, since a lot of you are here on today's webinar, you have some ideas as to how you could improve and are looking for some additional ways in which you can do that. So thank you again so much for participating in the poll. Before we go much further, I also wanted to introduce myself. As Marina mentioned, my name is Vanessa Chase. You may know me from my work online. I run a website called The Storytelling Nonprofit, which is also a consulting firm. You may read our blog posts online or perhaps see my tweets from time to time. I also speak at a lot of conferences throughout the year and facilitate workshops for different organizations. I do a lot of consulting and narrative work with a variety of different nonprofits in the US and Canada, including BC Children's Hospital, Hope for the Nations, Arasha Canada. We recently worked with the Wetlands Institute in the US, which has been really great as well. So lots of different ways that I've worked with nonprofits over the years to help them not only with storytelling, but also donor communications in general, which really kind of falls into this category of stewardship, which we're going to be talking about here today. So let's talk about what you're going to learn. A couple of different ways, or things that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about why donor stewardship is the best way to grow your fundraising revenue. We all know there are lots of tactics and strategies out there for fundraising, but I want to really highlight for you why I think stewardship is maybe our best tool. We're also going to talk about 5 tips to creating a donor stewardship plan. So I'll walk you through an abbreviated process as to how to do this for yourself if your organization does not already have a plan in place. We'll talk about some easy, cost-effective ideas for stewardship. And of course, I want to be able to answer your questions as well. I know that a lot of the value from these webinars comes from being able to get your questions answered. So we'll definitely be leaving some time towards the end of our webinar for that. So let's talk a little bit about donor retention. This is a really big topic and perhaps something that your organization can relate to. About a year and a half ago, Bloomerang Tech reported that the sector average for donor retention was at 41%, and donor attrition was at 59%. So this basically means that as a sector, we're often losing more donors than we're retaining year over year. And this is not good news for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it's expensive to acquire donors. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources, and the cost per acquisition is very high. So I'm sure if any of you have done direct mail or maybe telecanvassing to acquire new donors, you know that oftentimes the cost for acquiring a new donor to your organization can be 100% or close to it. It's pretty expensive. So that's definitely a big thing to keep in mind, is that the more we retain the current donors we have, the less we have to focus on acquisition. Instead, we can just focus on building the relationships we have, developing those gifts so that people are giving at higher levels, and hopefully leaving things like bequests or making a major gift or making some other significant contribution to our cause throughout the year. So another question for you that'll come up here as a poll that I'd love to know from you is, do you know your organization's retention rate? And it should come up here as a poll on your screen momentarily. So you can go ahead and answer that. We'll give everyone about a minute or so to respond. Wow, so about 66% of you have said no, you don't know your organization's retention rate. About 15% said yes, it's something you do know, and 21% said not sure. So this is, I would say, not surprising results. A lot of people I talk to have never calculated their donor retention rate before. They focus solely on the amount of money they're raising each year or how much money they bring in through events, different fundraising revenue streams, things like that. That's kind of their bottom line number. And this is not a metric that a lot of organizations focus on, but I think there's a big case to be made that this should be a metric that we should focus on more often, because there is a lot of value to knowing what that retention rate is and focusing on keeping donors year over year. So since a lot of you said no and 21% weren't really sure what it was, I want to give you a quick way to calculate what your donor retention rate is. And the reason why I wanted to kind of lay this foundation for us during the webinar is that stewardship is really about donor retention. It's about keeping those relationships and making sure that we can sustain them over the long haul. And I think it's always really important to start with some of these kind of foundational pieces to know where you're currently at in your fundraising program in order to set really good attainable goals for your organization down the road. So here's how you can calculate your donor retention rate. So fairly straightforward. I'll explain this calculation here on the page. So what you want to do is pull a report of the total number of donors who gave in 2013. And then what you want to do is then look at the number of donors from 2013 who gave again in 2014. So not the total number of donors from 2014, but just that segment of donors who gave originally in 2014, who made a gift again, who gave originally in 2013, who made a gift again in 2014. And so divide that first number by the second one and then multiply it by 100, and that will be your donor retention rate in a percentage format. So I get a lot of questions from people sometimes about how do we find this number and what do we do to get it in terms of figuring out how many donors gave in 2013 and 2014. So the best way I can explain this to you is if you're using a donor management software like Eraser's Edge or Donor Perfect, something like that, you have the ability to run queries and reports. And I found it's easy to pull these numbers through queries, surprisingly. So what you'll want to do is basically pull the query, and one of the query fields will be people who gave a gift in 2014, and perhaps you'll exclude people who maybe gave major gifts or gave certain types of gifts that aren't in your portfolio or aren't a focus. And then what you'll want to do is in the output of that query, make sure there's fields so you can see what their giving was in 2013 and in 2014, and then you can export that to an Excel to kind of figure out how many people were repeat givers the next year. I found that's the simplest way to take a look at that number. I'm sure there's probably a lot of other ways, and perhaps people who are a little bit more savvy with databases would tell me that maybe there is. So that's just a quick way that you can think about pulling that number. I think it's really helpful to do. If your organization does not have a donor management program like Razor's Edge or Donor Perfect or maybe even Bloomerang, and you're using something like an Excel spreadsheet or perhaps another way that you're tracking donations, you'll probably have to look at this a little bit more manually, but you could also just use the filter settings in an Excel spreadsheet to figure out who's given in which years to figure out what these numbers are for your organization. So definitely an important calculation overall. I would really encourage you to take some time, if this is a number that you have not ever seen before for your organization, to figure out what it was in the next couple of days. Maybe make a half hour or an hour in your schedule to pull these numbers and really get a sense as to what kind of donor retention rate your organization has. I think that's really important. So the reason why we want to talk about this and the reason why I focus on this is because there are, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of ways to raise money, right? We all have this end goal for ourselves of wanting to increase our fundraising revenue year over year so that we can fund our programs more sustainably, cover overhead costs, all those sorts of things that we need to be able to do running a nonprofit organization. But what I think is really important here is not necessarily about the tactics that we can use in fundraising, like trying out new tactics for email or maybe maybe trying out new direct mail pieces. I think the best place for us to spend our time and energy to really get a great return on investment is just focusing on loving the donors that we already have, and taking really great care of them. And that's where donor stewardship comes in as a really valuable fundraising tactic for us in the nonprofit sector. And frankly, not a lot of organizations do this well, so I think there's an even bigger opportunity for nonprofits to be able to do this really well and to be able to then stand out from the crowd, to really shine above a lot of other organizations who are not thanking their donors for their gifts in really meaningful and personal ways. So a couple of ways in which stewardship is really important for nonprofits. So first of all, it demonstrates impact and accountability, which is key. We know from work, some of the research that Penelope Burke and also Roger Craver have done, that donors want to know what their impact was. So how did that gift get used? What did you do with it? How many people were helped? All those sorts of facts and figures. Because at the end of the day, they want to know that they've done good in the world and that they made a good choice just donating to your organization. So being able to figure out what impact looks like for gifts at your organization is really key, and being able to then communicate that back to donors. Accountability is another key piece, which is a little different from reporting on impact. Accountability is really about demonstrating that that gift was used in the way that it was given to be. So if it was designated to a certain space or a certain place, you've told the donors that it was used towards that, or if they gave to a certain campaign, it went towards that specific project, those sorts of things. So that level of accountability and transparency is important in the kind of trust building process with our audiences. It's also a practice of gratitude, which is great, and there is so much research out there that suggests the wonderful benefits of being grateful and showing gratitude to people, the positive effects it has on our psychology as a receiver of that thank you, which are immense. And finally, I think it's also important that stewardship shows donors that you care about them. It's not all about your organization and all the awesome things your organization is doing, but it's really about your donors and showing them that they are a valued and important part of your organization's community, which I know intuitively we all think. We all know donors matter, that they're important, and as fundraising professionals, and I'm sure some of you are perhaps in communications or maybe even executive directors, you know that you care about your donors and that they matter to you, but we often don't do a great job of articulating that to them and showing them through our actions that we really do care about them and being a part of our community. So some of you might be wondering, well, like, these ideas all sound great, Vanessa, but does stewardship really work? Like, what is kind of the proof in the pudding, so to speak, that this actually works for organizations? So I wanted to show you a small case study from an organization that I've worked with for a couple of years now, Women Against Violence Against Women, WAVA, Rape Crisis Center, and they're here in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I'm also based. And in 2010-2011 fiscal year, they had a revenue of about $41,000. They get a lot of money from government grants, but this was just from individual donors who contribute to the organization, independent of those grants that they receive. But by 2013 and 2014, those individual donors were giving a collective $181,000 to the organization. So it was pretty incredible that over the course of about 2.5 years, they were able to increase their fundraising revenue really significantly. And the question was, how did they do it? Well, surprisingly, they did not focus on asking for more money. They focused on taking care of their donors. There were a couple of key things they did. They did things like monthly thankathons, where the board and the staff got together to make thank you phone calls to donors to say how grateful they were for their gifts and to talk to them a little bit more about the work that was happening. They added in more handwritten thank you notes, so sending out holiday cards and things like that, that really showed that somebody at the organization had taken the time to recognize that donor and actually wrote them a note that was highly personal. And also they started adding in more touch points without an ask, doing things like more intentional communication through newsletters and things like that that really helped donors feel deeply connected to that work. So in a nutshell, they use stewardship as their fundraising strategy to increase their fundraising revenue, which was pretty outstanding. They have a very high donor retention rate as well, and I think that that's really as a result of focusing on taking care of their donors. This is, I think, a hugely important activity for us, and I hope that kind of showing you some of these actual hard numbers as to what this sort of retention can have, or the effects it can have, can be really positive for you in making some great decisions about your organization. I can also share with you a couple of years ago, I worked with a social service organization here in Vancouver, and we would get a number of new donors every year in November and December. And in 2012, we decided that as an organization, we were going to call every single new donor we got during year-end fundraising, which was a lot. It was like close to 3,000 donors. And that was a big undertaking for us as an organization to commit to calling those people. But by March of the following year, almost 65% of those people had made a second gift already. So we had successfully retained them as new donors by using great stewardship. So lots of examples like that I could share with you. But I don't want to take up too much of our time today talking about case studies and how organizations have had success with stewardship. What I really want to do is focus on talking about how you can create your donor stewardship plan, which is what we're here to actually talk about. So I want to walk you through a couple of steps that I think are really helpful, that are kind of foundational steps to developing a better donor stewardship program. These might seem counterintuitive, but hopefully I'll be able to explain them in a way that makes sense and helps you see the value of doing these activities so that you're able to really not only speak to your donors in a way that resonates with them, but also really be able to meet their needs and wants as a donor. So let's go ahead and get started here in this process. So the first thing to think about is actually knowing who your donors are. I love asking this question to fundraising professionals, which is, who are your donors really? Do you know who they are? So often when I ask people this question, they'll say, well, you know, they're people who love our cause, you know, they donate to us, you know, they give twice a year. They'll give me facts about their giving history, but they don't really necessarily know much else about them. They don't know things like their demographic information or their psychographic information, both of which is really key. And the reason why this is important is because it allows you to honor who they are and what their preferences are as a donor. So I'll tell you a little bit more about why that's important. So demographic information is things like their age range, marital status, their family status, what they might do for work, where they live, all those sorts of composite details that might make up a person and who they are in their day-to-day life. Their psychographic details, on the other hand, are things like their worldviews, their political beliefs, their principles, their religious views, those sorts of things, which deeply inform how they make decisions on a level. So as organizations where people are giving to us oftentimes based for values-based reasons or principle-based reasons, it's really important to really have a good sense as to why people are giving to us and why they continue to engage with us as organizations. So by getting to know your donors better through things like donor surveys, you're able to start getting some of those important data points that can help you as an organization make better decisions about how to steward your donors. I'll give you an example. I worked with an organization a number of years ago that had a monthly giving program that was pretty big. They had a couple thousand donors in their monthly giving program. And the assumption that was made there was that the donors overall who gave to that organization were generally over the age of 65. They were retirees. And what we noticed, though, in kind of having some anecdotal conversations with some of the monthly donors was that they all seemed to be very young, a lot younger than 65. And so we ran a donor survey to ask people a little bit more about themselves as monthly donors, you know, what were they like? Who are they? We wanted to know them. And what we found, surprisingly, from that survey was that the vast majority of them were in their mid-40s. They had had a family. They had at least one child. And they were in the midst of their careers, so they were busy working adults. Which is a very different type of person than a retiree, right? And so when we started to notice this, the types of stories and the types of information we started to tell those donors changed drastically. We started to focus much more on telling them about children's programs, ways that we were working with other families, things like that, and also profiling donors and their families to show them that, you know, there were other people like them who were giving to the organization, which really, I think, helped to increase donor engagement overall in that segment of donors. So as I was saying, donor surveys are a very powerful tool that I would encourage you to use. There's a lot of free ways that you can create a donor survey. Using something like Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, you can create an online survey. I usually like to recommend somewhere between 7 to 10 questions at most to ask donors. And sending it out online is, of course, really great because then you're able to get the results in an Excel spreadsheet, and it's really easy to look at the data. You can also send out your surveys by mail as well if you do a lot of communication through snail mail with your donors. That's totally okay as well. It's a pretty low-cost activity. I mean, it shouldn't cost you that much other than staff time to run a survey, but it's a really great way to, again, start to get to know your donors a little bit more. And the reason why I recommend people do this is that so they can create a donor profile. And a donor profile is basically sort of like a fictional profile or a fictional summary of one person in your donor database. There's somebody who you make up who represents the averages and trends in your donor data. So this might be, for instance, in the example I gave you on the last slide about the monthly giving program, the donor profile that we ended up making up was somebody named Todd, and he was a CPA. He was 44, he had 2 kids, he'd been married since he was in his late 20s, and he was really interested in making a difference in the community, but also showing his kids how they could be charitable and helpful to those in need in the Vancouver area. And so that was representative in general of what we started to see in the donor survey results, which was really helpful. And knowing that, what we then did was every time we had to make a decision about donor stewardship, about communication, or even about our fundraising appeals, the question always was, would our donor profile Todd like this? Would he respond to it? And if the answer was no, then we kind of went back to the drawing board and thought about what could we do that would resonate with Todd. I know there's a lot of things to think about when we do stewardship and we do fundraising, but I always find it's really helpful to kind of have this image of one person who you're talking to in your mind. And creating a donor profile like this can really help you kind of hone in on who that person is and who it is you're really trying to talk to in your stewardship and in your fundraising work. So the other important thing, aside from knowing who your donors are, is also being donor-centered. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this term before. It was coined and I think trademarked by Penelope Burke a number of years ago, the term donor-centered. She wrote a really famous book on this concept called Donor-Centered Fundraising. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a great read that really compiles a lot of her research data about donor stewardship and about fundraising in the nonprofit sector. So a couple of things I want to highlight about being donor-centered, because this is a very key concept for donor stewardship. The first is that it's about the donor, not your organization. This is a really common mistake that I see in donor stewardship quite often, is that we talk about ourselves, the organizations. We did this, we did that. Look how great we are, we're doing great things this year. And we really, in that process of talking about ourselves, which we usually have good intentions with, manage to alienate the donor, which is not what we want to do. We want the donor to feel included in the community and a part of this great work that we're doing. So one of the ways we can change that and be more donor-centered is using the word you much more than the word we, as in we the organization. One thing I often recommend people do is pull up a copy of your most recent donor thank you letter, or even another communication you'd sent out to donors with the intention of engaging them, and really take 2 colored pens or maybe 2 different highlighters and go through and highlight the times you use the word you and the times you use the word we. And if we is much more present in that letter, it's time to kind of rethink some of those sentences as to how you could be more donor-centered and talk directly to your donors instead. The other thing that's also important about being donor-centered is it's not just enough to say thank you. Thank you is certainly important. It's certainly a key part of this whole process. But we also have to report impact. And I think I mentioned this earlier on in the webinar. Reporting back to donors about the impact is so key. I find a lot of organizations in their thank you letters or annual reports will say really vague things like, you're helping us make a difference, or your gift made a difference and we're really grateful for this, or things along those lines. You get the gist of what I'm saying. And the problem with this, though, is that donors don't understand how they made a difference. They have no idea what that difference was, and they need you to explain it to them, to give them examples. Things like stories are really great for this, because you'll be able to give them very tangible examples of how they were able to make a difference in the community and how that gift was able to impact people's lives or animals or the environment or whatever it is your organization might be working on. So I have a question for you all, and we'll take a bit of a pause here, and you can respond to this question in the chat box on your control panel, which is, what do you do to steward your donors? And so I'll give everyone a minute or so here to think about what that might be. You can type it in, as I said, in the chat box, things like thank you letters, maybe make phone calls. Let's see, so I'll go ahead and wait for folks to send in some answers here.
Vanessa, I think they're showing up in the question box.
Oh, are they? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Oh, wonderful. All right, so I see these. Great. So I see Sarah says they do phone calls and tours at their different sites and progress reports, things like that. Kathleen says thank you cards and phone calls, which is great. Barry says that they send thank yous. Heather says they have a donor newsletter. Newsletters are great, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more here in a minute. Anita says they do biweekly thank you cards and 2 donor stewardship educational nights a year. Donor stewardship events are a great idea, especially done well, because you're able to engage with donors face-to-face and also give them an opportunity to potentially see your work in action a little bit more. Let's see here. Mike says they do donor thank you letters. And a lot of people said thank you phone calls, which is great, wonderful. I'm glad to see so many people do thank you phone calls. Heather says they do thank you phone calls and letters, also Christmas cards, and also donor focus groups. Focus groups are another type of way that you can survey your donors and kind of take a pulse on their satisfaction and get to know them a little bit more. So that's also a great idea, Heather. I'm glad you mentioned that. Great, so lots of really interesting suggestions, and I'm really glad to see that so many of you are doing really key activities for donor stewardship already. So the reason, oh, there we go. So the reason why I wanted to ask this is just because we've talked about so far how to get to know your donors more and also what it means to be donor-centered, which are kind of 2 key principles of any donor stewardship plan. Those are kind of key ideas and concepts that we need to bring with us into each and every stewardship activity we do. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about the stewardship plan itself, which is really answering 2 questions. How and when will you acknowledge people's gifts? And also, how else will you steward donors in between making asks? So I see stewardship as kind of this twofold process, which is that, we want to immediately thank people when they make a gift, but we also want to offer them some stewardship or kind of engagement, cultivation, however you might want to phrase that, throughout the rest of the year to continue to keep them engaged with the work that our organization is doing. And our stewardship plan really addresses both of these things, ideally, and so I'll talk about that a little bit more here. So what I want to do is go through a couple of different stewardship ideas for you and your organization, and the first is thank you letters, which is a big one. So a couple of key tips for you for writing a better thank you letter. I highly encourage you to use a creative opening sentence, which is not on behalf of our organization, thank you for your gift, or starting with the word thank you. There are so many other fabulous ways to engage people in a thank you letter that does not start with on behalf of. And really, I think probably a lot of you are familiar with kind of the key concepts of copywriting in the nonprofit sector, which is that, we need to hook people or engage them right off the bat. The other great thing you can do is also give a specific example of how the donation was used. So again, talking about how people benefited from it, what happened, all those sorts of things. Including a picture or 2 of the work in action is also great. I know this is not always possible for organizations that work with children or maybe vulnerable populations. Things like confidentiality and photo releases can become complicated, so don't feel like that's something you have to do. It is nice, and I'll show you an example of one here on the next slide with that as well. It's also really great to be able to personalize the letter as much as possible. So using the donor's name, addressing how much they gave, and also when they gave and where they gave that gift to, I think is really key, because again, that shows that not only did you receive it, but you actually saw what came in and are really recognizing them for that very specific gift that they made. And sending it out promptly too is very key. I know this is a struggle for a lot of organizations that I talk to. A lot of the recommendations suggest that we send out thank you letters within you know, 48 to 72 hours after receiving a gift, which is fast, I know. And if you're a small organization, you might be thinking, wow, like we do not have time to keep processing gifts all the time. And I get it. I know that's challenging. So if that seems like it's something that's totally out of reach for your organization, work towards it slowly. Maybe try processing gifts once a week so that your turnaround time is within 5 to 7 business days, something like that. See what you can do to kind of build in time in your schedule to make opportunities to get those thank you letters out the door. So as I said, a couple of examples I want to show you. This first one is from Keep Truckee Meadows Beautiful, which I think is a really great example of a thank you letter that I want to share with you all. So as you can see, there's pictures down the left-hand side of the cleanup work that their organization did. And I'll read the letter to you here in case some of the text is a little blurry on your screen, but it says, imagine you're out for a hike, bike, or ride, enjoying the amazing natural beauty that Truckee Meadows has to offer. The afternoon sun shines brightly through the shotgun holes of an old television. A river of plastic chemical bottles snakes away along a ravine, and a lump just barely hanging on to its identity as a recliner belches pieces of foam into the wind. Thanks to you, these scenes are disappearing, and after KTMB's great cleanup on May 11th, the photos on the left cease to exist. That's the kind of result you can expect when you support Keep Truckee Meadows Beautiful through programs like Nevada's Big Give. You make our home cleaner and safer for everyone, and we can't thank you enough. So this is kind of a different thank you letter than what I'm sure a lot of you have seen or maybe even send out at your organizations. This tells the story, and maybe it's not a specific story about a person or a place, but it tells the story about what their community used to be like before this organization was able to do the work that they do. And what I think is really remarkable about this is that, you know, they engage people in thinking about, wow, how terrible was our natural environment before we were able to do this cleanup work. And what's happened now as a result is that it's cleaner, it's safer, and healthier for everyone. So a really interesting and kind of, I think, innovative example of how we can say thank you to our donors, so telling them, you know, stories about what it was like before our work was possible, and talking about why we're grateful that we're able to do this work as an organization and why we're grateful for the partnership of our donors. And later on in the thank you letter, they also, you know, they acknowledge the gift amount, when the gift was given, talked about where it specifically went to. So not only does it support us to help buy supplies and dumpsters for the great cleanup, but it also helps with river and neighborhood cleanups, children's education, and so much more. So a couple of examples of what happened in addition to being able to do their great cleanup. Another really great thing about this thank you letter as well is that it includes the organization's contact information. So an easy way for donors to get to contact the organization should they have questions afterwards. So another example I want to show you here, this one's from Cancer Care Connection, and I like this thank you letter for a number of reasons, although I would say that the second paragraph is a little long compared to the rest of them, so the letter looks a little unbalanced, but I'll read this here to you. So it says, when we received your gift, we were absolutely delighted. You're helping so many people who are affected by cancer, and we are so grateful that you decided to support them. Our cancer resource coaches are able to support countless people who call our support line each year because of you. Who are the people that call Cancer Care Connection? They're cancer patients, cancer survivors, their friends, and their family. Recently, Carol, a cancer resource coach, was able to help a young mother and her son who had been diagnosed with leukemia. They were facing immense emotional and financial hardships, and over the course of several counseling phone calls, Carol was able to help them find housing close to the hospital, emergency assistance for daily and basic needs, as well as to help her wade through the numerous options she was facing about her son's health care. So what's really interesting about this section in the letter is that we give the donor a very specific example of how someone was helped by this organization. So if we use jargony terms like thank you for supporting the cancer resource coaches and our cancer support center, you know, people may not necessarily know what that entails. That could entail a very broad amount of work. And so what's great about this is it gives a very specific example of somebody who was helped. So a mother and her son, it talks about what challenges they were facing, so emotional and financial hardships, and how the organization was able to help them through counseling and resource referrals. So again, acknowledging donors in a very specific way, telling them about one example of many where they were able to help somebody out through making a gift. So again, a really creative and interesting thank you letter that's very different from the standard one. And I hope that these two give you some ideas and inspiration as to what you can do for your organizations. So a question for you all, which is, what will you do to update your thank you letters? We've talked about a lot of different things with thank you letters, and you can respond in the question box in your control panel on let's see, it'd be on the right-hand side of your screen. So I'll give everyone a second to respond, and then I'll go ahead and take a look. So Karen says, add stories of impact, which is great. Jeff says, add a creative opening line. A lot of people have said a new opening line, which is great. I'm glad to get you thinking about that. I think it's a very easy improvement that we can make to our thank you letters. Let's see. Crystal says personalize their letters a little bit more, which is great. There's a lot of ways we can do that. A lot of us process our thank you letters through mail merges. So that's a really easy way for us to be able to do that. Wonderful, great. So I'm so glad a lot of you have ideas as to how you're going to update your thank you letters using stories, more creative writing, which is really great and tremendous. And I hope that you make those changes in the near future so that your donors can start to receive much more impactful and special thank you letters. So a couple other examples of stewardship ideas. Handwritten notes are a really great one for organizations for a number of reasons, mostly because I think that they add that extra level of personalization to the stewardship that we offer. A couple of things you can do to write more handwritten notes on your thank you letters is have board members write a few at the beginning of their board meeting. This is a very easy way for them to be involved in stewardship and in fundraising at your organization. Give them 10 minutes, give them a couple thank you cards or maybe thank you letters that you need them to write notes on, and have them do that before their board meeting starts. You can also use a different colored ink from the printed letter. I find that's nice just for contrast, and also helps remind the donor that somebody did actually take the time to look at this and actually sign it. And so I thought I'd give you a couple of ideas as to what you could write on handwritten notes, especially on your acknowledgement letters or pre-written thank you letters. You can just write small notes at the bottom there. Something like, I'm so grateful for your gift. Thank you for being a champion of our work in the community. You could also say something like, this year you've helped blank, whatever your organization does, and without your heartfelt gift, this would have not been possible. Thank you. There's lots of creative ways that you can say thank you and help people feel appreciated and feel the gratitude that your organization has for their gifts, and doing that is definitely a great idea. Another thing you can also do is thank you phone calls, which are a wonderful idea for a lot of reasons. Not many organizations actually make thank you phone calls, so taking the time to do this can really feel like a special moment for a donor. And is a really great way for you just to connect with them, to talk with them a little bit more about their passion and their heart for the work. So a sample script I thought I would give you here, which is on the slide. You could say something like, hi, my name is Vanessa, and I'm a staff member at the organization you work at, and I'm calling today to say thank you so much for your recent gift. We're absolutely delighted to receive it, and because of it, you're making blank possible. And you can tell them a little bit more about that. A couple of key pointers for thank you calls. I've always found it's very helpful to identify yourself as a staff member right off the bat, because a lot of times people think that you maybe are a telemarketer, which you're not. So telling them that you're a staff or a volunteer or just what your relationship is to the organization is really helpful. If it's a board member saying, I'm a board member at blank organization. And thank you phone calls don't have to take a lot of time. I know a lot of us are afraid of the phone because we think that people don't want to hear from us, that we might be annoying them or interrupting them. But the truth is that the vast majority of donors do appreciate getting these phone calls, and it's a great activity for you to do to provide better stewardship to donors, to talk to them a little bit more, and to ultimately build better relationships with them. So a couple other ideas for you as well, donor newsletters, which I saw a couple of you mentioned in your ideas about what you do to steward your donors. This one is from the Nashville Rescue Mission, and perhaps you've heard about this newsletter. I've had the privilege of meeting the gal who writes this newsletter each month. This newsletter brings in over $1 million a year for this organization. And it's a stewardship piece. It's not at all about asking for money, but they actually manage to fundraise money by having a really strong donor newsletter. And one of the things that's great about it is that it's focused on being donor-centered and also telling a lot of stories about impact. So this is one of the pages, I think one of the front pages of their newsletter, there's a message from their CEO. There's also this great feature that they have called the Mission in My Words, where they feature people from around the city in Nashville who talk about the organization and their connection to it. So why does it matter to them? Why is it important to be a donor to this cause? So it's another way to feature donor profiles or donor stories in your communications, which is great because this is a way that donors can see who else is giving to this cause, and they can connect with those people, they can see themselves in them, and really feel like they're a part of this bigger community who cares about this organization. In addition to things like that, they do also have stories about people who have been helped. So this one is about a man named Sylvan who was able to be helped through a job placement that they had, as well as their shelter program as well. So the story is pretty long, which is totally okay. It includes a couple of pictures. It talks about his personal journey from being homeless to finding a home, which is really great. Talks about what the organization was doing. And at the end, in the very last paragraph, it talks about how donors' gifts made this story possible, which is great because once again, it connects the dots for donors to know that this is the sort of thing their gifts are helping and their gifts are making possible. So if you're going to tell stories, definitely make sure that you include something in there that helps donors remember that they are the ones that made that possible, that they're really the heroes of that story. So a couple other ideas for you. Surprise and delight, which is a term I love, I guess terms that I love. There's a lot of things you can do to be surprising and delightful to donors that are kind of out of the ordinary or a little bit more interesting and engaging. Sending a non-branded thank you card is a really great idea. There are tons of thank you cards that you can send that don't have your organization's logo on it, that are really beautiful, that are really nicely letterpressed, and they are great to send as kind of an extra special thing to your donors. Confetti or things inside the letter can be really fun. I received a letter from an organization with a little bit of confetti. It was inside like a cellophane packet, and there was a sticker on it that said, "Today we're celebrating you." And it was a really great, very delightful thing to receive as a donor to the organization. It's something I've certainly never received from someone before. And it's just, again, a great way to kind of show that your organization is enthusiastic and happy that donors are part of the work. You can also do things like mission-driven gifts or events, and I included the mission-driven piece there because I think that whenever you do kind of like tchotchkes or events for donors, it's really important to make sure that it's a purposeful event, that it relates back to your organization's mission, that there's some clear tie to it. So it's not just some random thing that's happening, but the donors kind of see the connection to the overall cause that they're supporting. All right, so I want to talk about the actual stewardship plan now, which is kind of pulling all this information together. So as you'll see here on this slide, there's what we can call a stewardship matrix, or the plan itself, which is basically where we list off the different gift levels, or people who give to our organization, and what we're going to do throughout the year to steward them. So because of kind of the limitations of this slide format, I wasn't able to pull the whole thing into place for you, but I wanted to show you just a little snippet of what this might look like. So as you can see, the gift levels down the side, for instance, are $1 to $99, $100 to $500, $500 to $1,000, and the gifts of $1,000 or more. And three of this organization's stewardship activities are sending out acknowledgement letters, sending out their tax receipts, and also thank you phone calls. And there's probably a number of other things they would do as well. So what they've done is basically said in the other columns which donors are getting which touch points and when that happens. So for instance, they send out acknowledgement letters within 3 weeks. And for donors who make gifts over $500, they get a phone call within 2 weeks from the organization. So I know this looks surprisingly simple, and yes, stewardship planning can be this simple. It does not have to be overly complicated. I always suggest that people use something like an Excel spreadsheet or maybe a table in Microsoft Word to create a chart like this, and use that as your stewardship plan. And every time you need to refer to what you need to do to steward a donor, you have the plan clearly laid out with all of the activities you've decided to do that are manageable within your available resources and time, and listing out when they're going to happen within your calendar, which I think is really important as well. So again, just a pretty simple, straightforward process. It does not have to be complicated. And as you put this together and decide, which stewardship touchpoints you're going to use, definitely think about what your donors would want. So take into account information you know about your donors and also information about being donor-centered. So how can you make each of these touch points very special and very meaningful for the donors that you are communicating with. And I want to offer you a couple of other tips here as well. I always encourage people to monitor and evaluate the results you have from your stewardship plan at least once a year. There are a lot of ways to look at how stewardship has affected your fundraising. For instance, you can run queries or kind of test segments on looking specifically at, what kind of impact the thank you phone calls had on giving, or a special thank you event, something like that. It's important to look at those sorts of things, I think, because you'll get a sense as to what's working for your organization and what is not. It's also good, I think, to just evaluate in general your plan once a year to think about, are all of these touch points that we've selected still working for us? Are there new things we want to try? Or are there things that weren't working? What's going to happen here with this plan? And it gives you an opportunity to kind of take a step back and figure out the new direction for that. And of course, integrating the principles of great donor stewardship into your plan. So that includes knowing who your donors are and also being donor-centered. Really, the heart of this plan is just about taking care of your donors. So if you're feeling frazzled or overwhelmed by this process, I would just encourage you to focus on that one key fact, that we're really just about taking care of our donors and doing a good job of that. I know a lot of organizations here on the call are also from smaller nonprofits, which is great. And so if you're feeling like, wow, I don't know how we have time to do all this stuff, I want to offer you a tip, which is enlist the help of others. You have board members, you probably have volunteers, you have other colleagues and staff members who work with you. Get other people to be involved in this. Really, gratitude is an organization-wide practice, and it's a great thing for everyone to be involved in. The stakes are very low. You're not asking for money. You're simply saying thank you, and it's a really enjoyable, fun activity for people to be involved with. So if you are looking for ways to kind of build your capacity, think about the other people at your organization who can help you with this project, and start organizing them, maybe on a monthly basis, to come in and support stewardship in different ways. So with that, I know we have probably about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to leave some time for questions from folks who have sent them in.
Great. We do have quite a few questions, Vanessa, and I want to start with the thank you emails, the thank you letters. We had a number of people asking if it's okay to email a thank you letter. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So I think it's totally appropriate to email a thank you letter, especially if your donor gave online. So their primary communication methods have been through online channels with you, probably through your website and through email. So it's totally okay to do that. I think if somebody has given through direct mail and they're used to communicating with your organization through mail, recognize and honor that preference and mail out their letter instead.
That's great. And with the thank you calls that you were talking about, what if somebody gets voicemail? Should they be leaving a message?
That's a really common question I get asked. So what I recommend doing is trying to get in touch with somebody twice. So making one phone call, and if you get voicemail, try calling back maybe another time on a different day. And if they don't answer that time, leave a voicemail. Just let them know you're calling from your organization. You just wanted to say thank you for the gift. Tell them a little bit more about that. You can also say, if you have questions or have any, questions or inquiries about your giving or the work we're doing, here's a number to reach me at, and you can leave that for them in your voicemail.
Excellent. And do you have any tips for creating stewardship relationships with donors through social media?
Yeah, great question. So I think social media is a little bit elusive for a lot of us, right? Like, we can't always know who our donors are specifically on social media. That can definitely be challenging. One thing I have seen a couple organizations do, which I think is great, is on their donation forms online, they've included a field for people to enter things like their Twitter handle or their Instagram handle. And that gives the organization an opportunity to then know who those online donors are on social media. And it also gives them an opportunity to to publicly thank them on social media if they want. So I've seen Take a Hike Youth at Risk Foundation do that very well. They've sent out thank you tweets to their donors quite a bit. I've seen other organizations who posted pictures on Instagram of their staff members celebrating getting donations and tagging people who have made those donations that day. So those are really fun ways to be able to thank donors and also build relationships with them that way.
Fantastic. And when we were talking about the donor profile, we had a few questions about whether you had any tips for sort of how to create that or any resources you could direct people to.
Yeah, I definitely do. I actually think I probably have a blog post or two about that, which I could send to you, Marina, to send out to everyone after the webinar. I think the key thing that I always start with is the name of your profile. So who's the name of this fictional profile person who you're making up? And then start with their demographic details. So what is their age? What do they do for a living? What geographic region do they live in? Are they married? Did they go to college? And then you can, what I always like to do is just kind of write up like a small life story for them. It does not have to be long. It could be like a paragraph or two, but just give them some sort of history, talk about who they are as a person, how they came to donate, all those sorts of like little details that might make up a person. And then also include some of their psychographic details. So what are their worldviews, their political beliefs, things like that, which might also influence their giving and be a part of their motivation for donating to your organization.
Great. Moving on to the donor surveys, do you have any suggestions on the best ways to encourage donors to complete the surveys and any thoughts on what an ideal response rate would be?
Ideal response rates are, I think, one of the most common questions I get asked about fundraising. It really varies from organization to organization, and it depends. If you already have high open rates and click-through rates on things like email, then you'll probably have a good response rate to your survey, or it'll be somewhat comparable to what you already get through direct mail or through email. So I would really encourage you to just look at your own benchmarks that you have already at your organization and use those as kind of a starting point for thinking about that. In terms of getting better response rates, though, one of the things that I like to recommend is actually just treating the survey like you would any other appeal or campaign. So by that I mean giving it maybe 2 or 3 weeks to market, to tell people about it, to remind them to do it. So don't just send one email and expect them to do it. Send an email to people who have not responded, maybe an email to people who did not open the email to remind them about it, things like that. A tip that I got from a colleague of mine, Shannon Doolittle, was if you're going to send it through the mail, one thing you could do is make some thank you phone calls to donors ahead of time to let them know that you're really appreciative for their gifts and that you're going to be sending a survey to them soon. So to have them look out for that in the mail and send that back.
That's great. And do you have any thoughts on sort of what some standard questions might be that people might want to use to get started with the surveys?
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on what you're looking to learn about your donors. So one of the things that I like to do before I design survey questions is ask, what are my objectives? What am I trying to learn? What's kind of the 1 or 2 key things I want to know about this donor? So for instance, with an organization I worked with last year, one of the big things was wanting to know what are their demographics. So we asked a lot of demographic questions about what is their age range, what do they do for a living, are they married, do they have kids? We asked questions like that, which a lot of people I know will push back on me and say, those are kind of personal questions, but people will choose to either answer them or they won't. They'll feel comfortable answering them or not. You're not going to offend anybody by asking those questions. They have total freedom to answer them or not. It's okay. I also like to ask things like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with the stewardship that you've received from our organization? Or on a scale of 1 to 5, how well have you been thanked for your gifts to our organization? And then asking an open-ended question like, what could we do to better thank you or to better appreciate your gifts to the organization? I think those are really great questions. If you're looking to do things like improve your newsletters, you could ask them, have you read a recent issue of our newsletter? Did you like anything that was in there? What else would you like to see in our newsletters to get some ideas about what types of content you can include?
Wonderful. And we had a question from someone who I'm sure a lot of people on the call today can relate to this. Their organization sees maybe what would be considered smaller donations, so maybe a top gift of $200 to $300. The board is maybe pushing back a little bit on making phone calls to people that give, say, at the $25 level. What would your thoughts be on stewardship for an organization like that?
Yeah, well, I think if your board is pushing back on something like that, I think one of the best things you can do is show them case studies of why and how phone calls or stewardship has worked and why it's important to focus on stewarding those smaller level gifts. There's plenty of data in Penelope Burke's Donor-Centered Fundraising, also in Roger Craver's book, Retention Fundraising, that will give you solid numbers and proof that thank you phone calls do work, and that making those phone calls to donors who give at smaller levels increases the likelihood that they're going to make a 50% larger gift by close to 60%. So there's a very high chance that not only will they make a second gift after that, they're going to increase their gift because of the stewardship they've received. So my suggestion, especially if your board is in need of kind of some hard numbers or some case studies to prove that this is a good idea, look to some of the other experts, to other research that's been done in the industry that really shows that. And there's plenty of great research, and I'm happy to point people in that direction if they need that.
Great. And we'll just answer a couple more here before we call time for the day. In the stewardship plan, you focused on the gift level rather than the type of donor, like first time, returning donor, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice your stewardship plans. I know a lot of organizations have specific plans for first-time donors, which is great. I always think that it's good, though, especially if you're a smaller organization, not to overcomplicate things, so to keep things as straightforward as you can. If you don't want to be dealing with 4 or 5 different stewardship plans, then just find a way to create one, and one that works for your organization. You could also, for instance, in that stewardship plan that I showed you, include a column that says something like first-time donor, and maybe make a note about what you would do differently if it was a first-time donor in one of those gift levels.
Great. Now, how about corporate donors? We've talked mainly about individual donors today. Do you have any quick tips for stewarding your corporate donors?
Yeah, so corporate donors, I always think people get confused because we think of corporations like entities, and we forget that there's actually people running those companies, and it's people that we have relationships with and people who make the decisions to give to your organization. So if you're thinking about how to steward them better, think about who your key contacts are at that organization, and focus on stewarding them as people, not as a corporation. I think corporations love to be able to show that their employees are making a difference, especially if they are engaged in employee giving. So that's a great thing to highlight in corporate stewardship.
Wonderful. And I think this will be our last question for today, and I think this is a good place to end it off. Is there such thing as too much stewardship? Could it be possible to actually annoy donors with a little bit too much of this?
I'm sure it is, but I think the issue is that most organizations don't do nearly enough, and so I think that line would be pretty far away for a lot of us based on where we are with our stewardship right now. I think one of the things that might be an important factor is how many times a year somebody is giving. So if you have somebody who's giving 13 or 14 times a year, I know that's probably an anomaly for a lot of you, but let's just say for the example's sake, they're giving a lot like that, and you're providing them with a lot of stewardship, then there might be too many touch points. So you might need to just make a judgment call on your own and think about, how to scale back but still provide them with great stewardship each time.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you again, Vanessa. This was a fantastic and very info-packed session. I know that the participants on the call today had lots of questions and got lots of answers, so we really appreciate that. Before we sign off today, I want to remind everybody that we are going to follow up with you with an email tomorrow morning that will have the webinar recording and the presentation slides available in it. We'll also include a link to a very short survey, so if you could take 5 minutes to fill that out, it would be super helpful to help us further refine our webinar content and our delivery for the future. You're going to have an opportunity there to let us know if there's any topics you'd like to see us cover in a future session as well. So again, I'd like to thank Vanessa for her wonderful presentation today, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a very wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.